Afternoon, good evening, and welcome. This is Toby. I think most people online know me. I'm the Chief of Data for Action, a relatively new and small team set up in UNICEF headquarters a couple of years ago to drive a more strategic and coherent approach to our data work. This is, I think, the first external webinar we've run for quite some time. And I think it's an interesting moment for us a couple of years in to take our feet off the accelerators and take a pause to think about what are some of the lessons we're learning, what are some of the opportunities and challenges that we've identified, and really to discuss some of the vehicles that we're starting to put in place to address some of these opportunities to unleash the power of data to drive results for children. I'm excited that Emily is going to unpack her portfolio with us today, spend sort of 20 minutes or so covering some of the lessons, but also some of the opportunities that we are working through. And just before I hand over to Emily, I would just like to say a quick thank you to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I think thanks to an institutional strengthening grant from them a couple of years ago, it's really helped us to have a catalytic investment to drive and advance some of this portfolio. I think Shelby Wilson, who is our outstanding program officer based in Seattle, might be with us. Shelby, can you hear us? Are you online?
Hi, Toby. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm online. Can you hear me okay?
Very well. So maybe, Shelby, a couple of words from you before Emily kicks off would be great.
Great, sure, glad to do so. And thank you so much for the invitation to speak. And I apologize that I may not be very easy to hear. I just stepped out of a conference, and so I apologize for any background noise. I'm actually in the UN building, right where they're giving some school tours. So I'll try to make this very brief and hand it back to you, Toby and Emily. But on behalf of the Gates Foundation, this is a really exciting opportunity to take stock of what UNICEF, the Data for Action team, have done in developing a strategy, really a data strategy for children. The origins of this investment are really rooted in the long-standing partnership between UNICEF and Gates Foundation. Our organizations have shared goals to support children to survive, thrive, and reach their full potential. And where Gates Foundation is based in only a few countries and headquartered in Seattle, UNICEF is an organization we see as both a trusted advisor to governments and with an enormous footprint around the world, working in, where are you now, over 195 countries. And so we see these complementary roles in working to both enhance our collective ability as partners in the global ecosystem to analyze data for decision making, but also UNICEF is working to support partners to better use the data that are available to them. So this investment, I think, kicked off in late 2015 to accelerate UNICEF's efforts to strategically support countries and UNICEF teams in particular to more effectively collect and analyze data to inform key decisions. And this grant is, the work that the Data for Action team has done has been really inspiring because it's not just talking about data for decision making, but actually developing practical tools, engaging in consultations in many countries to understand what are the bottlenecks to making decisions based and rooted in evidence, and also the trade-offs of various approaches. I want to just highlight three things about this particular investment. One is the leadership role that UNICEF plays in developing the Data for Children strategy. This is a body of work that UNICEF has led to shape the vision of where the organization can go in helping both UNICEF as an organization and other partners support governments in developing a costed action plan and harnessing data to better make decisions for children. A second area is assessing the full continuum of data for children to understand different institutional needs, such as financial, structural, human resources, and beyond. So this work has enabled UNICEF to both understand and communicate that in a way that informs decisions. And then thirdly, taking this to the country level, because impact only happens at country level. And so working across the three levels of the organization, country, regional, and global, this has been perhaps the most exciting part, I think, from our perspective, is seeing how to work across the organization in support of impact at the country level. The last thing I just want to mention is the work is rooted in the strategy with global development at the Gates Foundation to support institutional strengthening, as Toby mentioned. And this is different from what many of the technical teams do at the Gates Foundation. Rather than investing in specific technical work, we leave that to program teams. But the multilateral partnerships team has worked very closely with UNICEF over the last year and a half to develop a partnership strategy that was launched last fall with Chris Elias, the President of Global Development, and ED4. And this signals a new way of working for the two organizations to best harness our capabilities and complementary skill sets to better program for children, and as well as to use data and use our joint assets together in service of children. And the team that I sit on really works to ensure that the corporate functions of UNICEF and other UN partners are set up so that the technical teams are able to deliver on their goals. So this is where this particular investment in the Data for Action team in the Data for Children strategy was rooted, and we're really excited about a next phase of this investment to continue to refine how technical assistance is provided, particularly around data. I'm going to stop here and thank you very much to Toby and Emily, Han, and team for the invitation to speak, and thank you to everybody for your interest in this. Okay, over. Thanks.
Super. Thank you so much, Shelby. Lovely introduction, and if you need to duck out, we totally understand. I think we are running a little bit late, so with that, I'm going to pass straight to Emily to lead us through some of the lessons and opportunities. Emily, over to you.
Thanks very much, both Shelby and Toby. I hope that everybody can hear us well. I'm really excited to tell you a little bit more about just a portion of the work that the Data for Action team does here at UNICEF. I want to keep in mind that there are several other members of the team, some of whose work you'll hear about toward the end of the presentation, but this is just one slice of it that's related to some of the work we've done over the last 18 months, specifically at the country level, working to make kind of our global level plan significantly more meaningful at a country level and more actionable there. So I'm going to talk to you about three things. First, I'll tell you a little bit about what it was that we actually did, where we went, and how we chose the places we went, and the process for developing a country-level data landscape analysis and an action plan. Second, we'll talk a little bit about what we learned, some of the common challenges that surfaced across all of the different contexts that require a better and stronger set of investments from the regional and the global level in order to respond to those country-level challenges. And finally, I'll tell you what we're doing about those. So the action going forward, hopefully with the discussion being generated in your mind throughout the presentation, and then we can have a discussion at the end about where you think we might have opportunities to partner a little bit better in solving some of these difficult challenges where we want to be very honest that we don't have great solutions, but we recognize it's a problem, and we suspect that we're not alone among agencies or data advocates in recognizing the challenge in some of these areas. So let's start quickly with the process. There are a couple of different pieces. There's first the global piece and then the country level work. So I'll tell you first, which Toby and Shelby have both hinted at a little bit, which was the development of the global data strategy. A few years ago, we had a very honest conversation both within UNICEF and with the Gates Foundation and some of our other donors, where we recognized that there was a lot of value to the data work that UNICEF was doing globally, but that the direction of that was not really clear. We didn't have a clear vision about the potential of data to drive results for children and about how UNICEF was well positioned and needed to position itself better in the future to take advantage of rapidly changing technologies, dramatic expanses in the availability of data, and new tools for putting data to use, not just collecting data. So we went through a global process, which was, as all UN processes tend to be, consultative, very heavy with revision, and came up with a roughly 20-page Data for Children strategic framework that lays out at a very broad level the vision that we have about the power for data to drive results for children, the principles that we think should underlie data work in investments from the organization, and really a commitment to making sure that we're paying attention to all three pillars, the demand, the supply, and ultimately the use of data for children, making sure that we're investing in equal proportions in all of those areas and not overemphasizing one at the expense of the other. So that came out almost exactly 2 years ago, which is part of the timing for this presentation, marking that 2-year anniversary of the release of the strategic framework. 6 months after that, we produced the second document, which was really a glimpse into some concrete examples of what we see across the organization in how we're kind of exemplifying some of those principles, recognizing that there's a lot more work to be done. At the same time, we recognized that that global level document was not sufficient to actually drive the results that we wanted to see at a country level. And so we started on a process of building country level action plans. So looking across a broad variety of contexts and digging down at a country level and seeing what some of those principles meant. So when we say that we believe that data investments should support government systems and not supplant them, at a practical level, in Mozambique or in Zimbabwe, what does that actually mean? In the same thing in a lot of the other contexts in which we did this type of work. So what you see in front of you now is a map that shows both the dozen countries where we've completed this country level work so far, a few other countries in West and Central Africa that are underway right now, a few more that are planned in the next couple of months. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how they've come to be on this map. So the original plan that we had was to do this work in 6 countries. We wanted a few countries in a couple of different regions to cover some diverse context. Intentionally, we wanted a mix of low and middle income, low and high capacity, humanitarian and non-humanitarian contexts. And the great news is that there was way more appetite than we anticipated. And so we ended up leveraging other resources from across the organization and doing a lot more cost sharing than expected. And so we are now at 15 countries and counting, using that same initial investment that came from the Gates Foundation, but now having catalyzed even more than the initial investment in terms of other resources. So we were intentionally strategic in our original choice, and we have since been quite opportunistic in expanding it to additional countries. What you don't see reflected on the map is some of the ambition that we have for the coming year. And in East and Southern Africa, for example, they're developing a regional strategy which proposes doing this same work across the 20-something countries in East and Southern Africa, which we're very excited about. We're also ready to start experimenting with support to many smaller country offices at the same time. That will likely cover many of the UNICEF offices in Eastern Europe and in Latin America and the Caribbean once we get that model rolling. So that's just to tell you a little bit where we are, and I'll tell you now about what it was that we actually did. So it's a relatively straightforward 3-step process. The first is looking not just at the whole portfolio of UNICEF work and all the potential issues that might impact children in a particular country, but looking specifically at the areas of work impacting children where we think a change in the way that data work is done or data investments are made would actually result in a change in results for children. So there are some areas where UNICEF may be working, but we don't think data is potentially going to be an effective leverage or lever to actually change results. And so we left those to the side, and we really focused on those places where a different way of doing business in data might actually change results. With that narrowed down list of topic areas and priorities, we then work to map the data landscape in those areas of work. So what are the partnerships that are underway? What are the investments that others have planned? What are the strengths and weaknesses of government systems in those circumstances? And where do we see potential for investment from UNICEF or from others? And finally, based on those first two steps, we built the actual action plan. So that includes taking a very realistic look at where we think UNICEF over the next 3 to 5 years could plausibly make a meaningful impact. There may be issues where government really needs an investment in a particular sector, but UNICEF is not well placed to do it, or another partner already has an investment plan there, and there's no need for additional UNICEF input. And so building the strategic action plan both around what our own capacities were, what others were planning to do, and what the clear needs demonstrated in the country are. And finally, we don't want it to end with a plan, but moving on to the implementation and the learning stages. So that's at a very generic level. The real keys that we wanted to make sure is that these were really directly actionable and wherever possible costed, so that offices could fundraise around the plans themselves. And we wanted them to be about the change in the use of data, and then working our way back to whether or not that meant data collection, whether it was new or different tools, rather than taking a tools first approach, which has been too common across UNICEF and other agencies in the past. So that's the generic explanation. The next slide that we'll show shows you a little bit about what the types of explanations that come out are. On the left, you will see something that you probably can't read, which is very tiny prints that shows you kind of sector by sector some of the big areas where this particular country office identified needs. And then two examples on the right where hopefully it's slightly more legible to print. But the idea that we had from offices was actually to not have a uniform type of report that came out so that every country looked exactly the same, because we recognized both that governments are in a different state in terms of their government data systems, et cetera, and that the relationship between UN offices and the government might be different context to context. So the structures of the reports themselves vary. We have some, the one from Zimbabwe, for example, has it broken down by things to stop, things to start, do more of, do less of. The one that you see here is about specific interventions that UNICEF should move forward with. The next page of this report is actually specific policies that UNICEF should support. And then you see some of the concrete action that's recommended there. So I'm going to pause for half a second, make sure that there aren't any specific questions on this before we move into some of the learning that we did by looking across the first 12 offices to do this work. So if you have questions, you can certainly type them throughout the process in the chat box, and then we'll have time for a Q&A in just a few minutes. So the lessons piece, when we finished in the fall of last year, the first 10 or 12 of these, we started to look across the variety of contexts. We had several offices, as you saw, in East Asia, several in East and Southern Africa, and several in the Middle East and in North Africa region, covering, again, a variety of contexts. The interesting thing in looking across all of those reports was that many of the same issues, despite the variety of context, came up again and again as a recognition, in part, of the many challenges that are quite similar, regardless of the type of context in which our offices are operating. So the first big category that came up as a theme was the need to really strengthen our internal data capacity of UNICEF as an organization. Part of that was about building data savvy within UNICEF offices. I think that we had a very generalized way of discussing this at a global level. I think a lot of people refer to it as data literacy. But what was really clear from these reports is that it's not so much an issue of literacy as savvy, where not everybody needs to have the same skill set across an office, whether you're the head of an office or whether you're a health specialist or a program officer. But the skills may be different, but what we want is a culture within UNICEF where people have the skills that are appropriate to their position, where they are comfortable asking for and using data in the context in which they need to do it for their own jobs. And there's a lot of work to be done on that. Second, and related, is the ability to communicate with and about data and to advocate with data and for data. And there's work going on in that area too. And then finally, interestingly, of kind of the top 10 issues that came up, this is the only one that actually came up about the need to collect more data. I think there's often a very strong emphasis placed on getting more and more data, but of the top 10 challenges that we saw, only one was related to more data, and the other 9 were related to doing something else differently with the data or the skills that we have already. So in this particular case, it's addressing data gaps on key marginalized populations, and in particular on politically sensitive issues. So sometimes it is ethnically neglected ethnic minorities, sometimes it's culturally sensitive topics like genital cutting or discrimination against particular groups that have been historically marginalized. So there is a recognized need across context to address some of those specific data gaps. The second major area is what I want to call emerging issues, though they're not always emerging. It just means that UNICEF and the UN in general have not moved as fast as the rest of the world has on some of these issues. One, which is very important and came up again and again, is this idea of making data systems work better together, both horizontally and vertically. I think there's a lot of appetite for this. It was demonstrated in almost every context in which we worked, where we want recognize the value and the potential of interoperability, but that in most cases, the ability of moving beyond those first 2 sentences of, wouldn't it be great if health systems spoke with education systems, spoke with criminal justice systems, we don't have really good, clear examples of what that looks like and clear guidance for the first, second, and third steps that governments and their partners should be taking to make those systems work better horizontally and vertically, up and down within the system itself. Second, this is sort of related to the emerging issues, is the idea that we need to have very clearly articulated standards, guidelines, and practices around privacy protection and ethics when it comes to new data sources and new data technologies. There's a tremendous appetite across UNICEF and our government partners to jump into lots of new technologies, which is great, but sometimes that appetite outpaces our ability to think through the policy implications and our actual protections being put in place to make sure that children and their families are protected when we move into uncharted territory. Third in this area is the need to address some administrative data quality issues. As above, with the interoperability of systems, there's tremendous appetite to start getting more data from admin systems and to make better use of them, in part because of their timeliness, in part because they're already in place within government. And there's a recognition that there are data quality issues, but there's not really a clarity on exactly where we start with those issues. And finally, there's an unresolved giant box on the unique data challenges and opportunities in some places in dealing with data in humanitarian contexts, which we'll get into in just a couple of minutes. The last box is really what we want those first 2 boxes to actually be supporting. We want strengthened internal data capacity within UNICEF and to address those gaps in order to improve our work with governments and ultimately improve government systems. The strengthening of the systems really depends on a couple of different pieces. One of those is making sure that when we have all the great data, we've done all the great analysis and supported government to do all that analysis themselves, that there's an appropriate culture of data use within government itself so that data is actually changing the way things are done when it comes to decision making. Second, offices are continuing to struggle around sensitive topics with governments. Sometimes those are actual substantive topics, not being able to address childhood marriage and issues like that. And sometimes it's the general topic of data that is itself sensitive with governments. We have a lot of experts in M&E and data and in other areas like that that are really brilliant in their subject matter, but feel less comfortable addressing some of the political economy issues around negotiating with government on some of these sensitive topics. And they're really looking for actual guidance on how to engage with government and have those discussions when government is not interested in data transparency or in collecting data on certain issues. And they're looking for more guidance and support on that. Finally, the thing that offices are feeling the need for is improving our own capacity with UNICEF and the UN to strengthen government capacity, whether this is on a systematic level across a lot of different topics, whether it's for analysis, collection, use, etc. So these are the big 10 issues that came up again and again, and the ones that we think need better global and regional focus. So now, and finally, with a deep breath, we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing about some of these issues. I'll start first on the issues that we think that we actually have got some solutions, either ongoing or planned, and then get into some of those thornier issues where we do not have great answers. We would love to talk to you about some of the solutions and opportunities that you've seen in those areas, or at least commiserate that we all share the same problem and need to talk more and find solutions. So in terms of strengthening internal data capacity, this is, I think, the place that we feel most confident about the processes that we have going forward. Right now, in terms of data savvy, we're doing mapping across the organization of really what we think data savvy looks like as a skill set and a set of behaviors in a lot of different functions in the organization. We're compiling resources and looking at best practices for how we build not just the ability to do pivot tables in Excel, but how we change culture around leadership asking for data, making use of data, and making sure that they're making data-involved decisions. This also goes as far as discussions with HR colleagues about adjusting competencies and the way that we do recruitments, not just around positions like M&E, but around sector specialists, et cetera. We're also putting out a number of different tools and resources and trainings on data communication and data advocacy. This comes up very often in shorthand as we want data viz, but we know that it goes beyond that, and we're working to help offices articulate very clearly what it is they want to do with data in order to get them back to what skills, communication, and steps they need to take to actually do those things. And finally, I think the area that people are most familiar with a lot of UNICEF's data work is our work to address data gaps on marginalized populations and on particularly sensitive issues. So this involves not just new methodologies for measuring things, including adolescent mental health, well-being, et cetera, but also additional advocacy and new approaches to making sure that we close those data gaps and we measure the progress of marginalized populations toward achieving the SDGs and all of the other development goals that we have for children. The work that we're doing in this second area on the gaps and emerging issues is a little bit more nascent than some of that. We do have ongoing work going across the organization related to data privacy protection and ethics. This is one of those topics that I suspect in other agencies is true as well, where the responsibility of this is scattered across different teams within headquarters, and we're doing our best to come up with a combined work product and blend the best enthusiasm and tempering enthusiasm from different teams in headquarters and in field offices to make sure that we've got actionable guidance that is coming out and helping offices as they confront new and different challenges on a daily basis. The last two areas, we've got two full-time team members, which we're really excited about, who've joined the team within the last year, some within the last month. So on administrative data quality issues, we are working with our new specialist, Karen Carter, who's joined us about a year ago, who's working on an administrative data quality framework so we can get through some of those issues and helping offices figure out where they should prioritize their investments in improving the quality and addressing some of those challenges when it comes to administrative data, and working more on the interoperability of systems and the ability of systems to get data both all the way up to a national level and back down to a facility level so that it can drive changes in results. And most recently, a colleague, Kate Alley, has joined us from UNICEF's emergency team as our full-time specialist working on data in humanitarian contexts. She brings wealth of experience on a lot of these different topics and is really focused on making sure that we have a clear vision about both the potential and clear understanding of the challenges when it comes to dealing with data and using data in humanitarian context. So we'll put a pin in it for now, but there's a lot more to come from Kate and her team to be formed when it comes to addressing some of these challenges. Finally, we have not a typo, unfortunately, the box on working better with governments. And there were 3 bullet points here originally, and these are 3 things that you're going to see again in the next slide on areas where we don't have great things in progress at the moment, and we would love to hear more about what you're up to. So I'll just skip to that slide right now. making data systems work better together. We've got lots of ideas, but this is obviously work that goes well beyond the scope of UNICEF and the scope of children, and I think it's a space for a lot more intra-agency discussion across the UN about how we make those investments work better together, as well as the technical work of making data systems work better. The same goes with the culture of data use, and I think there's potential for a lot of synergy there. We'd love to hear more about, from your organizations and your perspectives, what has or has not worked in changing the culture of data use within your organizations and what lessons we can draw from that when it comes to partnership with government. Similarly, we recognize the challenge of addressing some of these sensitive topics with government, and would love to hear about how that has or hasn't worked in your own experience. And the same goes for strengthening UN capacity to strengthen government capacity. We'd particularly love to hear about things that you have planned that we may not know about yet, so that we can make sure that our investments are aligned and taking into account what's going on with others. Finally, I'm going to close on some exciting news, because we recognize that the challenge of getting this done isn't just a technical challenge of having solutions to implement and having a plan to follow over the next 3 to 5 years, but honestly it really takes the results or the resources to get those done. And those resources aren't always financial. Sometimes they're technical resources, sometimes they're technological, sometimes they're about talent. And so we are going to be this week launching the Data for Children Trust, which is going to bring together a lot of those different resources. So the financial, the technical, the technological, and the talent in getting contributions from all comers. So sometimes that may be private sector data that we have access to that could be used by offices for particular purposes. Sometimes it will be direct financing for pilot projects where we can demonstrate global value. And sometimes it could be lending specific specialists either from New York or from some of our partners and other agencies or from outside donors to help get that work done. So stay tuned. There'll be more information coming on the Data for Children Trust. We're very excited about that and would love to hear about partnership opportunities to route more resources through that. So I'll close here with just an introduction to our team. I think I've mentioned everyone here except Han, who is driving the engine behind this conversation at the moment, and who's done a lot of our work around knowledge, learning, and communities, and my colleague Mac, who helps implement some of those global solutions. So when we find a solution that we want to scale across the world, we don't want it to just be a bespoke solution for one office, but we want to have we want to have the global resources and solutions available for all offices and for other UN agencies to be able to access them. So there's our contact information. You can find any of us. And finally, I'll leave you here with a couple of questions that we'd love to start this discussion part of the conversation. Do you agree with what we found? What are we missing? And what opportunities do you see for moving forward? Thank you so much for your attention, and we'd love to hear your questions either on the audio line or through the chat box.
Great job, Emily. Thank you so much. So let's see if folk are ready, willing, and able to chip in either now or, of course, thanks to the previous slide, you know how to get us offline afterwards if not. Looks like a couple of people typing.
Hello, may I come in?
Of course, please. Serge.
Hi, Toby. Hi, team. Thanks for that exciting presentation. I'm quite happy to see the progress that Emily, Han, Mac, and team have done so far. And thanks for the invitation to join this webinar. It was really worth my morning. I had a few questions and comments when I was listening to the presentation. It's been, I think, quite exciting progress. I mean, we've been looking at UNICEF for as a model, right, as something, an example of how to do things when it comes to data. And I'm quite happy to see that it's coming through in a way that sort of validates our admiration for your work. It's quite amazing. I was wondering though, the global strategy that was launched a few years ago. Do you have a system in place to actually monitor progress on the strategy? Are you tracking some performance indicators across UNICEF on how the different offices are implementing the strategy? And if you are, what are the outcomes of that? In the country list, I could see actually a lot of overlaps with many other data initiatives by various partners. So I was wondering, at the country level, as you're engaging at country level to develop the country action plans, how do you actually engage with those other data players? Because there's quite a few in some of those countries. I see in places like Ghana, for example, where there's so many international partners working with the government of Ghana and many local data stakeholders. Is there an element of coordination that came into place in deciding an engagement with those other partners in identifying exactly where UNICEF can add value to that data landscape, and maybe how what UNICEF is doing could be complementary and collaborative with what others are doing at country level. I'm actually also quite curious about the efforts that you're doing to strengthen internal capacity. I think this is definitely something that we could share across the system, or the agencies, the practices that you're putting in place to ensure that staff within UNICEF are data savvy. So I'm wondering if there's any particular targeting of which staff you actively reaching out to ensure that they have the required data skills, or is it something that is a blanket approach where it's a capacity for all UNICEF staff, and as a data team, a data for action team within the organization, do you actually have the right? What are the sort of entry points that you would have to actually have that kind of impact across the whole system? Because speaking from UNDP, which is a highly political organization with very different departments and divisions, and each one having their own standard operating procedures and processes, it's very difficult for one entity in one place to have some recommendations that apply across the whole house. So if you do have some lessons there or some practices that could be shared with other agencies, that would be quite useful. And finally, I actually did not quite hear in Emily's presentation any specific reference to the SDGs. That's our bread and butter nowadays, particularly when it comes to data and those issues of data gap, of exclusion, and data privacy. It's and UNICEF is, of course, a huge player when it comes to data for the SDGs. So I don't know to what extent that actually factored into your work in developing national data action plans. And also, this loops back again to this question of how you engage with other players at national level. We are in this maelstrom of UN system reform, in which there's some discussions about, for example, pulling together data capacities and resources from various agencies at country level or at regional level. There's a lot of that conversation that's going on. And how are the national action plans and even the regional plans that Emily referred to adaptable to that changing context, which is changing actually very fast? I mean, we don't know what the end result of all of that is going to be, but it's active discussions happening right now. And are you looking at that as well to see how UNICEF would position itself within the UN family as one of the biggest data player out there? That's it for me. Over. Thank you again for a great presentation, Emily.
They're super questions. I think we could spend an hour with you unpacking these, and maybe we should at another time. But maybe Emily and I can answer, or just give you a few headline thoughts on some of those. Maybe I'll start on the strategy, and how we've monitored it over time. in short, the answer is yes. We have some critical success factors that we are using to monitor what we nearly call, I suppose, institutionalization, if we need to use a UN word. So how do we take something that Emily and I think we'll both be quite self-critical if we look at it 2 years on and say something that was necessary but not sufficient, and to a certain extent quite theoretical in terms of our aims and objectives. But within it, there were three things that we were really keen to drive. And in part, if we think about UNICEF's internal capacity, that was a critical mass of people who can articulate demand for data work, that know what good looks like and know how to get it. And we didn't talk during the presentation about two vehicles that we're using to help us do that. One is this interdivisional task force on data at headquarters level that really makes sure we know that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. But secondly, something we've implemented more recently is this data help desk. So really a single point of contact within UNICEF where people can funnel their demands from the field. And we're really keeping a very tight grip on both of these vehicles to understand how successfully we are pivoting to the field and really better serving colleagues in terms of those frequently found challenges. And then in response to that second element, I think Emily will talk perhaps a little bit more about UNICEF's comparative advantage at the country level and how we're really trying to hold some feet to the flames with the action plans to say, does it really make sense for UNICEF? But at a global level, we're keen to look at exactly that. Where are there a number of country offices who are struggling with certain areas that we can respond in bulk? Geospatial solutions is an example that, as Emily mentioned, MAC has helped us drive forward relatively recently. So an area where UNICEF was behind the curve, and we were able to, by a number of not only long-term agreements with partners, but put in place the data, the talent, and the technology to better meet those needs. And I think the extent to which we can address the reactivity of our team to respond to those challenges with not only guidance, but practical tools to run at pace is another really good indicator for the extent to which we are making some of these shifts that the strategic framework started to mention. So that's a quick few words from me on how we're monitoring institutionalization of the strategic framework. Emily, maybe do you want to talk a little bit more about the country level and the engagement elements?
Yeah, let me just start in the order that you addressed these in, with how we're looking at a country level, how this work interacts with other initiatives and other data players and how we're engaging with them. And that's exactly the point of doing this this country level landscaping and analysis, is that we want to make sure UNICEF is not doubling over the top of an investment that's being made by UNDP or the World Bank or UNFPA or others. We want to make sure that our work is complementary and it's rooted in the comparative advantages that we have. So when this work is being done at a country level, in some cases it's being done by an external consulting firm who's being brought in. We have 3 different firms engaged through a long-term agreement. Some cases it's being done directly by the country office themselves, but they're doing interviews with not just UNICEF staff, but government counterparts as well, and other players within the data landscape. So looking at other UN agencies who are relevant in the particular topic areas where we're interested in engaging, et cetera, talking to them about what they're doing already, what their planned investments are, et cetera. So for example, the landscape analysis and action plan that came out of Lesotho actually highlighted very specifically some of the UNDP data work that was going on and said, UNICEF, don't repeat this, just support the UNDP work that's going on with the Africa Data Hub through Lesotho and a couple of other countries in that region. And so I think that's a perfect example of something that our country office may not have known about because they're not particularly active in that space. And now they know that they can be supportive of another UN agency doing the work without having to make a major investment, and that their money would be better spent in a different area where there isn't another agency participating. So that's exactly the point of it, and we make sure that we do speak with those. Obviously, this is easier in a country like Lesotho where there are fewer players than it is in a Ghana or a Kenya or Philippines, but it is definitely the intent and work that we're undertaking. And I would say I'm going to skip ahead to your question on the SDGs itself and all the conversations that are happening within the UN family about this. So as to the conversations within the UN family, I think this is definitely something that we are trying to engage at a country level with members of the UNCT, et cetera. In some cases, there's been a recommendation for UNICEF, because it is a data lead in that country, to start a data task force or some other data group of leadership through the UNCT. In some cases, that structure already exists, and so we're saying become a good participating member, but it's being led by someone else. So that has happened in a couple of different places. With specific regard to the SDGs, that was somewhat intentional that I didn't get into it very much, because the tendency that a lot of our colleagues have had when it comes to talking about the SDGs is really just about collecting data for monitoring progress toward the SDGs. That is incredibly important, something that we think has got a lot of value added for both the work of UNICEF, our government counterparts, and ultimately for children. But we think that it is an incomplete perspective on really how data can be directly used to drive results. So whether that is local level decision making on education budget allocations is very different than monitoring progress toward a global SDG target. So we want to make sure that we're being more inclusive in our discussion, which is why we've shied away from it. Now, when it comes to a country level plan, some countries are very focused on that. A lot of their plan has been about, do they have appropriate data to measure the SDGs? But we're pushing them to be more expansive in the way that they're thinking about data. Finally, when it comes to the discussion that you had on internal capacity and sharing across the UN, we'd be more than happy to. Just an update on where we are progress-wise. We're expecting a report from our consultants in the next month or so that identifies some of those major savvy gaps in some of the resources that are available, as well as recommendations for places where there aren't good available resources, where either UNICEF or other partners may need to invest in developing some resources. Right now, we have a lot of these resources available through an intranet site. In the next quarter, we're looking to externalize a lot of that stuff to make them more globally available public goods for other agencies, but we'd certainly be happy to have a conversation with you about that, as well as about the entry points for making a change in the organization. I will say the approach that we have taken that's been most successful so far is that we have not tried to push down the highest barriers of resistance, but we've actually just sort of pushed through the open doors. There's so much appetite across the organization for these things from so many people that we have been more than swamped with work by just going to the places where the appetite is and building up both the data savvy in that group of folks, as well as the appetite for them to become ambassadors of data, for lack of a better term. And we think that that's going to be the much more successful route, rather than trying to say everyone in this particular sector needs to have this exact set of skills. We're going where there's appetite and political momentum, and that's been much more successful for us than other approaches.
And I think that's a very good bridge to Lucinda's comment in the chat field, right? And I think all of us as a team are really trying to walk the talk of data as a team sport. And if we can play that role of matchmakers, informed matchmakers, to say what are the demands on the field and how do we best match them with appropriate and timely data, talent, and technology. This is where the fund comes in. Lucinda, I share your excitement. I think it's an interesting vehicle that we're, again, starting thanks to the seed funding from the Gates Foundation, and we'll add others to that. But we're really trying to look at it in the broader fund. That's why we've used the language trust rather than fund, to make sure that there is the opportunity there to think about slicing and dicing contributions from others to match demand internally. So we'll certainly keep you abreast of that as we move forward. And I think, as you flagged, the opportunity to collaborate with the University of Edinburgh and the data hub there is obviously a key element for us. I think with that, we're nearly out of time. Let's see if there's any final questions online.
Yeah. There's hi Toby, this is Karen from GPS Studio, and I'll be very brief because I know we're running out of time. But yeah, just to say this was a really interesting conversation, definitely worth my time, as Sergey has mentioned. I think just to reiterate, we've been looking up to UNICEF on this work, and I know we had a chat with you, Karen and Emily, late last year around how we can work together. And just to reiterate that you can count on GPSDD's support on the work, on the actions that you have put forward. And I think from our Leave No One Behind collaborative, definitely those interests on admin data, and I'll be happy to reach out to you, Karen, on how we can work together on this. The other thing you mentioned, and I know, Emily, for your the slide on government was blank, and I think that was a good move, because working with government and working better with government is both technical and political. As UNICEF, is UNICEF ready to get into political conversations about data with government and on data use? If yes, what's the plan? If no, who do you think would be a useful player in that? And of course, I'm certain GPSDD would be interested. I'm also curious on the country research that was done, the case studies. Was there an element of a political economy analysis? I think you hinted to that, but I'd like to know, because I know once you get into political conversations with government, it's not a one-size-fits-all. One strategy works in government A and it doesn't work in government B. So I'd just like to know the extent to which you did PE analysis and what are some of the things that came out. Lastly, out of this work, what really surprised you guys?
Very good. Super. Let me just start quickly. I'll pass to Emily. We're so appreciative of what GPSDD is trying to achieve. And I think your comments really reiterate the value that the partnership can bring to this work. I think all your points are spot on. Actually, let me pass to Emily first, and I'll come back.
Yeah, I would say I don't think we have an option to not get political with government. Government and data are political, and if we want to play in that space, we have to figure out how to do it better. I don't think that we have the right solutions, and we don't necessarily have the right skill sets in the organization to have those conversations at the level that we need and to do the type of political economy analysis that's needed to do it. In terms of the second question you had on whether there was a PE analysis done, it varied a little bit from context to context. So some of these reports were done very directly, hand in hand with governments, and in those cases, it was about what was politically feasible and on the table to have a discussion with government about. In other cases, it was more of an internal report for the UNICEF office, in some cases indicating ways that they could work around particular political barriers with government. So the context really shaped whether or not it was an internal report or an external report to government or with government. So it varied a little bit, but underlying all of that was a recognition that our offices need to be able to have those conversations regardless of what form the particular report took.
And just what I wanted to add was I think there's a sequential element to this. So it's very flattering to hear both you and Serge say, we're looking up to UNICEF. Certainly sitting here, it doesn't feel like that. And I think that's because of this element of getting our own house in order. And it's why Emily presented in the sequence that she did. We still feel like we have quite a lot of work to do internally to be where we need to be. And I think, therefore, there's a sequence to some of the internal strengthening that we need to go through. And then when we're in a good enough shape to drive that support to government. So I think we're trying to take a humble approach, and we're definitely stronger together where the partnership can support. So I think that's a good point to end on. Thanks so much for joining. As you know, reach out to us as and when, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And congratulations.